Hello and welcome to this master class by David Lynn, presented by the Alma College MFA in Creative Writing. Greetings to our MFA students present both online and in this room. This is the Wright Lapine Opera House. The ballroom is the home of our summer residencies. And welcome to the writers participating who are exploring the Alma MFA for their own creative journeys. Launched in 2021 on the foundation of Alma College's 135-year commitment to the arts, the Alma College Master of Fine Arts and Creative Writing is a diverse and dynamic artistic community that teems with energy from a shared commitment to writing. The two-year program features a rigorous literature-based curriculum taught by a dedicated faculty who are also well-published authors. The curriculum is designed to develop a student's ability to read and think critically and to write with a high level of artistic proficiency. While in the program, students gain confidence in their voices and discover how to write and wield their words in ways that may change the world. The low residency format is the heart of the program experience and offers 10-day residencies twice a year in the summer and winter with intensive semester study with a faculty mentor in the genres of fiction, creative nonfiction, and poetry. And our students here would be happy, I think, to tell you about that after the class. The experience we have for you today, a master class in public reading by the author and creative writing Professor David Lynn, is an example of a regular feature of our residencies, the practice of inviting visiting writers to benefit both the students who attend lectures and informal talks with the writers, and the Alma community who can attend their public readings. During our first residency, the Alma MFA had the pleasure of hosting US Poet Laureate Joy Harjo virtually, and MacArthur Fellowship winner Khaled Madawa in person. At our next residency, which begins June 16th, our visiting writers will include the poet Matthew Dickman, photojournalist and memoirist Deborah Kopaken, and the novelist S. Kirk Walsh. The opportunity to learn from such artists, in addition to working one-on-one with our excellent faculty, has allowed the Alma MFA to quickly develop a presence on the literary scene as a world-class artistic community and quality graduate degree. We invite you to join our talented students by applying now. The deadline for summer residency is May 1st. And now I'll introduce our visiting writer, David Lynn. David Lynn was the editor of the Kenyon Review, an international journal of literature, culture, and the arts from 1994 to 2020. Now, as editor emeritus, he remains professor of English and special assistant to the president of Kenyon College. In 1990, he founded the KR Young Writers Program, and in 1997, the KR Writers Workshop. As an author, he received an O. Henry Prize in 2016 for Divergence. His latest collection, Children of God, New and Selected Stories, was published in 2019 by Braddock Avenue Books. Of this book, T.C. Boyle said, exquisitely wrought stories that dwell deeply in place and character. This is a revelatory collection. And Anne Patchett, the stories in Children of God are graceful and astute, beautifully written and keenly intelligent. An earlier volume of stories, Year of Fire, was published in 2006 by Harcourt Incorporated. In a review, Publishers Weekly said that the stories of this collection occupy the gray borderland where betrayal mixes with trust, violence with affection, humiliation with lust. The effect is quietly haunting. And the New York Times said Lynn feels his way toward tentative, glancing resolutions that avoid glib epiphanies and leave his characters, like the professor in Life Sentences, numb and sad and lonely. A still center as the emotional chaos of these people swirled about him, destroying so much. David Lynn is also the author of the novel Wrestling with Gabriel, an earlier collection of stories, Fortune Telling, and a critical study, The Hero's Tale, narrators in the early modern novel. His work has appeared in magazines and journals in America, England, India, and Australia. Other awards include the Glimmer Train Short Story Prize 2015, the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award finalist, and the Ohioana Library Association Award for Editorial Excellence. David lives in Gambier, Ohio with his wife, Wendy Singer, a distinguished historian of India. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Sophronia, and thank you all, and welcome to this. I haven't done this kind of presentation or class before, so we'll be playing together and investigating it, and we'll see how it goes. Let me say that my typical method, as you'll soon see, is very informal and casual, and I like conversations rather than lectures. And I'm going to be so informal as to step off for a moment, get my bottle of water, because I'm in trouble without it. So I really hope that during the course of this conversation, people who aren't here, along with people who are here, will ask plenty of good questions. Use the chat feature on the Zoom, and we'll take some questions, because to me and my method, that is very important. Let me also say that I'm a big fan of the low residency MFA format. I think that it is a great way to study and hone your skills as a writer. You both build a community with the other people who are there and come to the residencies, the intensive residencies here, but you also get to lead your lives and work at home and do in-depth sessions with talented individual instructors. The thing I like best about low residency MFA programs is that it's for people, by and large, who have significant life experience, as opposed to traditional residency MFA programs, where a lot of the people who are there have not done a lot other than be students. And they may be very talented, but I think you need something to write about. And so I really like the low residency format. And I'm a big fan of Sophronia Scott, so I'm so glad that she invited me to come and be with you today. I asked her to ask you to read the story Lobster Night by Russell Banks, which I think is a really interesting story. It's disturbing, it's fun to read, it's full of surprises, but I think it's also pretty teachable. And so I want you all, please, here and abroad, to look at the beginning of the story. Stacy didn't mean to tell Noonan that when she was 17, she was struck by lightning. She rarely told anyone, and never a man she was attracted to or hoped soon to be sleeping with. Always at the last second, an alarm in the center of her brain went off and she changed the subject, asked a question like, "How's your wife? You ready for another?" There's a lot going on there. Let me say, by the way, and you all know this, but I'll say it anyway, we all read in different ways and for different purposes and using different methods. As a lover of literature, you read for pleasure. You read just for the fun of it. As a literary student, you are a scholar, you learn to figure out what something means. What does a story mean? As an editor, you read, how good is this? Is this something that demands to be published? Can I not say no to this piece of work? As a writer, you read to understand how something works. You ask the question, why does the author do this rather than that? So for example, in this story, and I'm going to come back to this at the very end, one of the striking things is Russell Banks continues to write in the past tense, when I think there might have been a chance to put it in the present tense and make it even more dramatic later in the story. But we'll come back to that later. But we have this very striking beginning about Stacy didn't mean to tell Noonan that when she was 17, she was struck by lightning. Boom, like a bolt of lightning. It starts immediately with this defining thing for her. She's struck by lightning when she was 17, something that's happened before. She didn't mean to tell Noonan. Why? Why did she not intend to tell Noonan? So all these questions are popping up for the thoughtful reader, pulling us in immediately with this very vivid thing that here's for someone who was struck by lightning. And yet, she's reserved about it. She's private about it. She doesn't tell anyone about it. She doesn't intend to tell Noonan. So there are all these questions that are raised immediately before we go into an extended bit of exposition. There's a lot of exposition in this story. It's very well done, but it's exposition. She was a sometime bartender at Noonan's. Notice there's not even a paragraph break there. This is just a direct continuation of the opening of the story. She was a summer bartender at Noonan's, a sprawling log building with the main entrance and kitchen door facing the road and 3 large plate glass dining room windows in back, and a wide redwood deck cantilevered above the yard for taking in the great sunset views of the Adirondack Mountains. So it's pretty striking that Russell Banks is modulating here within one paragraph from introducing the issue of Stacy, the main character, being struck by lightning in the past, which immediately suggests this was a defining element for her. This is a big deal for her, but she doesn't talk about it. She's private about it. Then, at the beginning of the second paragraph, the night that Stacy told Noonan about the lightning was also the night she shot and killed him. What? 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 Now, if we were sitting around a table together, with a cup of coffee and just being relaxed, my question to you all would be, why does Russell Banks do that? Why does he tell us at the very beginning of the story, in essence, part of the climax of that story? What happens? That not only does she go against her intentions of telling him about Noonan about being struck by lightning, but then she shoots him. So that too, it both pulls the reader in, which is what you all as writers always want to do. The beginning of a story is the most important part of the story. Because if it doesn't work, your reader is just going to turn the page and go on to something else. So Banks is certainly pulling us in, is certainly propelling the story forward, also suggesting a lot of dramatic conflict. With Noonan, on the one hand, she tells him something she doesn't intend to tell him. And we also know she was attracted to or hoped soon to be sleeping with. Okay, we get that at the very beginning. And yet, then she turns around and shoots him. So we know this from the very start. So there's dramatic conflict, there's tension, and for the reader, there's immediate suspense. Okay, what draws a reader through a story, the thing that propels a story, is narrative tension, energy, something that is moving towards something. The narrative tension is one of the defining elements for me of short stories as opposed to novels. And we can talk more about that later if people would like. So the beginning of a story is the most important. I will tell you, however, that the hardest part of the story always, always, always is the ending. That's where many stories go wrong. Is trying to land the ending like a talented gymnast landing that dismount. If you don't land it, boom, the whole thing collapses. So then we get a good bit more exposition about who Stacy is. Because Stacy, after all, is the narrative center of this story, and we sort of need to know her in order to pursue the questions of the lightning strike, of why she's here, of who she is, of what she's doing. she had rented an A-frame at off-season rates. She's a ash blonde, good looks of a poster girl for women's Nordic sports, tall, broad-shouldered, flat-muscled with a square jaw and high cheekbones. But despite appearances, she viewed herself as a plain-faced 28-year-old ex-athlete with the emphasis on ex. Okay, so one of the things we're finding out early on about Stacy is this disconnect between the way other people see her as a very attractive, youngish woman, free spirit, all of those things, but she herself doesn't think very highly of herself. She thinks of herself as plain-faced, as an ex-athlete. And we know that the way she has lived up until now is going from one failed relationship or not very promising relationship to another. Over time, she lived briefly and serially with 3 local men in their early 30s, men she called losers even when she was living with them. Slow-talking guys with beards and ponytails, rusted-out pickup trucks, and large dogs with bandanas tied around their necks. Otherwise, and most of the time, she lived alone. So she doesn't think very highly of herself. And the men she hangs around with, she herself acknowledges as losers. And most of the time, she seems to be happiest on her own. But she was experienced, so she starts to work for Noonan, and she's done this kind of job before. She was experienced and had cultivated a set of open-faced, wise guy ways and a laid-back manner that protected her from her male customers' presumptions. So again, there's this distinction between the inner and the outer. From the outside, she seems pretty tough, attractive, but tough, and able to respond to guys coming onto her without getting into trouble. But internally, she's much less secure. All right, this is part of the internal tensions with her. And then there's this wonderful passage. She was a shy North Country girl who, when it came to personal matters, volunteered very little about herself, not because she had secrets, but because there was so much about herself that she did not yet understand. To me, this is a kind of signal point of the whole story, of where it's going from here. Most stories, for your information, tend to be about characters who are at one way or another at inflection points in their lives. Okay, they could be 11, 12, 13, going on puberty and adolescence and their life changing. They could be 21 or 22, leaving college or going out into the world or trying to find what their adulthood selves are going to be. They could be 35, or in this case, 28, and making that transition from being young and sexually vibrant to that next stage, which is kind of shadowy and uncertain. And, what is this, adulthood and maturity and, oh my God, middle age and beyond. I won't talk about the beyond, I'm too intimate with it. There was so much about herself that she did not yet understand. She did understand, however, that the last thing she wanted or needed was a love affair with a man like Noonan, married, 20 years older than she and her boss. She was seriously attracted to him, though. Boom. So she says one thing, last thing she needs, she's not going to do it. He's 20 years old. She was seriously attracted to him, and not just sexually. Not just sexually. Which was why she got caught off guard. And in a sense, I think this is sort of the secret of the story, and it's what's driving her and Noonan. She has this, Noonan in some way isn't her type at all. She shouldn't be doing it. And he's cruel, and I think the technical term is asshole. But she's drawn to him. She's attracted to him. She knows she shouldn't. But therein, again, for writers, this is a way of creating desire. You know, a few minutes ago, I was talking about tensions and narrative tensions, what compels stories along. Desire, and there are lots of different kinds of desire, but human desire is the most basic way of propelling stories, of propelling human beings. We never stop desiring, ever. You know, briefly after you've had sex or a good meal, you stop desiring, but that passes pretty quickly, right? The only time you really quit desiring is when you're dead. It was late August, a Thursday. So we go from the general exposition, the setup, you know, who she is, how she got here, what's going on, the attraction for Noonan, you know, blah, blah, blah. And suddenly we're in the specific moment. This is a very typical move in a short story where the opening paragraphs or pages tend to be in the conditional tense. This would happen. This is the kind of thing that would happen. So no particular moment, but the general situation. And then you get to the particular dramatic moment. Now, Banks is like a really brilliant musician here in the way he's playing in and out of the things I'm talking about. So the story begins with a very specific thing. On the night that, you know, she told him about being struck by lightning, and it was the night she also shot him. Boom, and then you pull back into generalized exposition. And then here we get the specific moment again, a Thursday in late August. And more exposition about how Lobster Night comes to be. Let me do a slight aside here for a moment. Most of the stories I write and teach and read about are in the realist tradition. There are lots of other perfectly wonderful genres to write about. But the literary genre tends to be realism. One way or another, a representation, a mimicking, a mirroring of reality, of the real world. There are lots of different ways of doing it. But it's the putting of characters into a particular space and time. And I would go further to say that even in genres like science fiction or mysteries or romances, the better ones tend to be located in a very, very, very particular place. So I'm a big fan of Tolkien, okay? I believe that Frodo lives. I believe in Frodo. I believe in the Shire. And it's because Tolkien gives it to us in such granular, physical, evocative detail. Okay, that's how it works. That's why we believe in it. Okay, and I believe that literary realism works the same way. So what Banks does in this story that helps make it a really great story, I think, is locating Noonan's joint in such particulars. Back in June, Noonan did all the cooking himself and decided that he could attract a better class of clientele and simplify the menu at the same time if, during the week, he offered nightly specials. And this goes on and on and on. And there's lots of description here. There's lots of exposition about Stacy and Noonan and the place and all of that. And the reason for it is to persuade the reader in the reality of this place. So that if you were driving in New England and you saw Noonan's by the road, you'd say, oh yeah, I know that place. You have that feeling, okay? And I think that's one of the keys of literary fiction, is to create vivid particularity. You're creating characters who couldn't be any other place or time. They're here, they're now. And then we get to the recurring issue of the lobsters. This is lobster night after all. And we get the lobsters introduced at the end of the session that begins, it was late August. A couple of paragraphs later, you ought to either get a bigger tank or else just don't buy so many of them, Stacy said. Noonan laughed. Stace, he said, compared to the cardboard boxes these guys have been in, the fish tank is lobster heaven. 4 days of swimming in this, they're free range practically. He draped a heavy hand across her shoulder and drummed her collarbone with a fingertip. They don't know the difference anyhow. They're dumber than fish, you know? You don't know what they feel or don't feel. Maybe they spend the last few days before they die flipping out from being so confined. I sure would. I sure would. I sure would. What has Stacy just done? She's identified with the lobsters, which is kind of weird, but also kind of wonderful. She has this imaginative, empathetic capacity, and also a kind of hunger, a kind of yearning. It's not just that she relates, I'm never going to use the word relatable, to the lobsters, but she actively projects her imagination to try and figure out what is their perception of the world? What does it feel like to be a lobster? And you'll remember later in the story where she sees the lobster eye and she tries to imagine what it's like to see through a lobster eye. And on the one hand, she's keenly aware she can't do it. She's not a lobster. But what matters more to the story is her bone deep desire to get out of herself and imagine what it's like to be a lobster, as opposed to Noonan, who has no empathetic interest in anything other than himself. Okay? And the reason I spent some time on it now is because in this story, if you look back through it, you'll see that this issue with the lobsters and the you know, what are lobsters? How do they perceive the world? Blah, blah, blah. That comes up 4 or 5 separate times in this short story. So clearly, Banks thinks it's important, that it's an important issue of the story, this empathy for a creature that's doomed to be boiled alive. As a, you know, and the difference between Noonan and Stacy. Another thing. This is the way I teach, by the way. I do jazz riffs. Something will occur to me and I'll go off here. And you know, you can unplug or go to sleep. That's okay. This is the way I teach. All authors write their stories, all of them, including you, on the assumption, on the hope, on the desire that the reader will read a second time. Okay? And in fact, with a good author and a good story, if you don't read it a second time, you won't get it. You'll get a version of it. But so much is going on throughout a story that you can only fully understand when you see it the second time. And, oh, right, he does that here at the beginning, so at the ending, it makes a different kind of sense. You only get that with a second reading. So when I urge you, when you come across a story you really enjoy, read it a second time or put it aside and come back to it sometime later and read it again. You'll be glad you did. And with my undergraduate students at Kenyon College, one of the things I tell them is, I'm not really teaching you this story. It wasn't written for you, it was written for adults. It was written for people who are at a later stage of life than you are, even though you're very bright and very smart and have lots of potential. What I'm doing is trying to give you the skills so that when you come back to the stories when you're 40 and 50 and 60, you'll have the skills and the tools by which to understand them more readily. That's the whole point. And then we get Noonan for a little bit. In Noonan, though, and it talks about his cruelty, his hunting, and his ability to be cruel. She wasn't noticeably soft-hearted or sentimental when it came to animals, but shooting and trapping creatures you didn't intend to eat made no sense to her. She was sure it was cruel and was almost ready to say it was sadistic. In Noonan, though, it oddly attracted her, this cruelty. Okay. And I think that Noonan is a wonderfully realized, even if horrible, human being. We get a sense for him. I think we believe in him, just as we believe in Stacy. And I think that the spark and attraction between them is one of the driving forces in this story. You know, she's put off by his cruelty, even though she's attracted to it at the same time. It had the same strange otherworldly innocence of the animals he liked to kill. And then he asks her whether she's ever been a vegetarian, and she says, yeah, once. Once when I was 17, I kept it up for a while, 2 years as a matter of fact, till I busted up my leg and had to quit college. He knew the story of her accident. Everyone knew it. She'd been a local hero before the break and had become a celebrity afterwards. Then she goes on, it's hard to keep being a vegetarian in the hospital though. That's what got me off it. No shit, what got you on it? That's when she told him, I was struck by lightning. Okay, and so things are tying together here. I reached for the light switch on the wall and bam, just like they say, a bolt out of the blue. But it didn't kill you, Noonan tenderly observed. No, but it sure could have. You could say it almost killed me though, but it didn't. So there's this interesting little tug of war between them, where she's sharing this very intimate and powerful experience and what it meant to her. And he's resisting. He's saying, well, it didn't kill you. It didn't kill you. It couldn't have been that bad. It didn't kill you. And that's sort of not the point. Obviously, it didn't kill her. But he's resisting her desire to share with him on her terms. He wants it to be on his terms. She says farther down, no, it really changed me. It did. A bolt of lightning went through my body and my brain, and I almost died from it, even though it lasted only a fraction of a second and then was over. It changes you, Noonan. That's all. Another riff, if you'll allow me. Short stories are all about change. The whole point of a short story, is either change or failure to change. When a story builds those tensions up I was talking about earlier, those narrative tensions, and they're driving towards a release, otherwise known as a climax, out of the climax, 95% of the time, a character is changed or fails to be changed. That's what it's all about. That's why we read stories, to see characters change. That's why we emotionally engage with them. And so when she says to Noonan, no, it really changed me, it did. A bolt of lightning went through my body and brain. So the change has already happened in one sense to her. And I'd suggest that what the rest of the story is about is how that change has never been resolved. She says, being struck by lightning changed me, but it's also kind of isolated her from other people. You know, the story says at one point, she says, or is thinking about how this is something she doesn't share with anyone. No one else can relate to this. So it cuts her off, and that's a kind of burden that she struggles with. And then Noonan shares his own story. And we're not going to go into this very much. But again, you have to read the story a second time to understand the way Banks is foreshadowing and playing with us. So Stacy, on the one hand, says to him, what's it like being struck by lightning? It's like being shot with a gun. Well, someone gets shot with a gun here. And then, in sharing his own experience, profound experience of change, except doing it in a lousy way, Noonan talks about the time he's attacked by a bear and lies under a cabin for several days after the bear comes in and destroys it. Well, obviously there too, it's a kind of ironic foreshadowing of what happens at the end as well. The bear escaped into the night, but Noonan lay trapped under the fallen roof of the cabin, unable to move, his right arm broken, he assumed, and possibly several ribs. That's when it happened, he said. What? That's when I knew there was me and there was everybody else. Just like you said, it changed my life. Well, what's wonderful about this is it's both the same and the opposite of what happens to Stacy. When Stacy has the experience with the lightning bolt, yes, she's separated from everyone else, but that's a terrible thing to her, and she wants to be empathetic. She wants to understand the lobsters. She wants to understand human beings and isn't able to. The lesson he takes away is, it's me and them, and I'm not going to let them get to me. All right, so it's a very different response to the experience. I wish we had more time. There's so much to go through here. Yeah, I will share this wonderful exchange with the lobster. In the fat fish tank, the one last lobster bumped lazily against the glass. Remember that last lobster, because it comes back too at the very end when Noonan is sitting in the kitchen eating in a gross way this last lobster. In the fish tanks, the one last lobster bumped lazily against the glass. Stacy wiped down the bar and came to a slow stop by the tank. She leaned down and gazed into what she believed was one of the lobster's eyes. More of a greenish knob than an eyeball, anatomically absurd to her, and tried to imagine what the world of Noonan's family restaurant looked like through that knob and the 30-gallon cell of cloudy water surrounding it, and beyond that, the lens of the algae-stained glass wall. It probably looks like an alien planet out there, she thought. That's such an alien planet, the sense that of failures to understand, of different creatures being cut off from each other, and the inability to see the world in a shared way.
I make an observation, David.
Sorry?
Can I make a comment?
Please.
One of the lines that up a little bit further where because you're talking about her empathy over and over, and Noonan's inability to empathize, she talks about him as if he were a different species, just as she's seeing the lobsters as different species. And she says, this line totally struck me. It freed you from having to compare yourself to him. So she is so empathetic. She's like comparing herself to even these lobsters, but she's seeing him as so extremely different than her. She doesn't even have a desire to empathize with him almost.
That's great. I think that's exactly right. I hope everyone could hear that. That's really great. So now finally, towards the end of the story, we get that second bear appearing. She had never seen a black bear close up, although it was not uncommon to come upon one in the neighborhood, especially in midsummer. So we're building towards climax here, though we don't really yet have an idea of what it is, but in the back of our minds, What do we know? We know she's going to shoot him. So the question that, is haunting us throughout is why? Why? She wants to sleep with him. Why does she shoot him instead? Then Stacy saw Noonan and several other diners, all of them men, out on the deck. They too stared down into the yard below the dining room and in the direction of the basement door, where Noonan stashed his garbage and trash barrels in a locked wooden latticework cage. The men were somber and intent, taut and almost trembling, like hunting dogs on point. That's a great metaphor. That's a great metaphor. What metaphors do, coming back to our discussion about the lobster and its eye, the reason writers use metaphors is not simply to make connections between things, but help us see in a more enhanced way. By comparing two things, we see them in a different, enhanced way. And so seeing those men on the deck as if they were hunting dogs is funny, and yet it gives us a different kind of truth than just talking about them trembling on the deck. And then Noonan begins to shoot. He shot once and he missed the bear altogether. He fired a second time. Notice how in this, and again, if you were to do an analysis of the story, if you read it a second time, notice his sentence work. The sentence, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but how at this section, when he's shooting the bear, how the sentences tend to be short, declarative, and to the point. He shot once and he missed the bear altogether. He fired a second time. The bear was struck high in the back and a tuft of black hair flew away from his chest where the bullet emerged. The crowd in the dining room groaned and cried out, "He's shooting it! Oh God, he's shooting it!" A woman screeched, "Tell him to stop!" And children began to bawl. A man yelled, "For God's sake, is he nuts?" That's a good question. Gail looked beseechingly at Stacy, who simply shook her head slowly from side to side, for she could do nothing to stop him now. And then, from the short declarative sentences, watch this sentence that spools on and on and on. And this is where I sort of, as an editor and writer myself, looking at a story that I admire enormously, think, given the immediacy of this might almost be better in present tense, because there's no distance from it here. What past tense gives us is distance. What present tense does is press our nose right up against it. He hit the bear in the shoulder and the animal spun around, still standing, searching for the source of this terrible pain, not understanding that he should look up, that the man with the rifle, barely 50 yards away, was positioned out of sight above him, and because of his extreme anger, this is one sentence. Because of his extreme anger, because of his refusal to be impersonal in this grisly business, was unable to kill him. And so he wounded the poor creature again and again in the chest, in a paw, and shot him through the muzzle until finally the bear dropped to all fours and, unsure in which direction to flee, tumbled first away from the restaurant downhill toward the woods, and then, hit in the back, turned and came lumbering, bleeding and in pain, straight towards the deck, where Noonan fired one last shot, hitting the bear this time in the center of his forehead, and the bear rolled forward as if he had accidentally tripped and died. That's a deliberate tour de force. That's an author saying, watch what I can do. And we do. It's a pretty amazing sentence. The first time we read it, we're not aware of that. We're just too caught up, I think, in the speed and the power and the awfulness, the grotesqueness of this. But now, here, we can step back and see, the tour de force that Banks is employing. The men who had stood with him on the deck outside were ashamed now to have been there. Making as little of it as possible, they joined their wives and friends. And then When it's over, Gail, the other server, when everyone had left, Gail walked slowly from the dining room to the bar where she took off her apron, folded carefully and set it on a bar stool. That's it for me, she said to Stacy. With trembling hands, she knocked a cigarette loose from the pack, lit it, and inhaled deeply. Tell me he can mail me my pay, she said, the fucker. She started for the door and then abruptly stopped. Without turning around, she said, Stacy, why the hell are you staying? If we had more time to talk about this story, and if we were talking, especially if we were talking about it in a literature rather than a writing class, to me, that's a really big question. Why does she stay? It's not that I don't believe it. It's not that it doesn't ring true, which is the measure of all fiction. Does it ring true? If it doesn't ring true, you've got a problem. But for me anyway, this rings true that she decides to stay, but I'm not sure why. Why the hell are you staying? I'm not, says Stacy. In a voice so low she seemed to be talking to herself. Gail said, yes, girl, you are. Then she was gone. So she goes into the kitchen, and there is Noonan like a barbarian, tearing the shell and the flesh of that poor last lobster. He took the last lobster and was eating it off the counter. Notice that repetition. And was eating it off the counter. So that, you know, a deliberate repetition like that is very deliberate and very powerful. Eating it off the counter with his hands, broken shells and the remains of his shattered carcass. Verbs are really good. And the specificity of the nouns here, the remains of its shattered carcass lay scattered in front of him. He poked a forefinger into the thick, muscular tail and shoved a chunk of white meat out at the other end, snatched it up and popped it into his mouth. This is violent. He's employing violence against the dead lobster because he's still so angry. He's still so pissed off. Stacy picked up the .22 rifle and looked it over. She slid it into shooting position against her right shoulder and aimed along the barrel through the screen door and the fluttering cluster of moths to the outside lamp. Well, I'd love to have caught you at the moment you read the story for the first time and asked you, what do you think's going on here? Why is she picking up the rifle? What's her intent? Where is this going? I don't think there's any easy answer to that. But I would say we're always aware as readers that we're reading a story, that there's always drama and tension involved. And so when we see her pick up the rifle, we may not know why, but we can be filled with a kind of a kind of anticipation that this is going somewhere. Slowly, Stacy brought the rifle around and aimed it at Noonan's skull. Noonan, she said, and he turned. Yeah, sure. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger and heard the explosion. And when she opened her eyes, she saw in the middle of Noonan's broad white forehead, and here again, look at the sentence structure. It's a kind of parallel of what happens with the bear. Oh, and remember, he shoots the bear through the forehead. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger and heard the explosion. And when she opened her eyes, she saw in the middle of Noonan's broad white forehead a dark hole the size of a dime, which instantly expanded to a quarter, and his large body jerked once as if electrocuted and flipped backward. His astonished face gone from her sight altogether now, and she saw instead the back of his head and a hole in it the size of a silver dollar. And then another great description, his body, like a large rubberized sack of water, fell to the floor, spinning away. She laid the rifle on the counter beside the broken remains of the lobster, crossed to the stove where the pot of water was still boiling, and shut off the gas flame. Slowly, as if unsure, so I think it's pretty clear But this is the climax of the story. That's not a surprise. It's pretty obvious. And she does what we know she's going to do at the very beginning. And we know that it's had an effect on her. It's had a change on her. We're still not quite sure what. Slowly, as if unsure of where she was, she looked around the room, then seemed to make a decision and perched herself on a stool next to the walk-in refrigerator. She's made a decision. We never know what that decision is, just that she's made one. She leaned her head back against the cool stainless steel door and closed her eyes. Never in her life, never, when an author repeats a word like that, it's loaded, it's extra emphasis. It's not an accidental repetition. Never in her life, never, had Stacy known the relief she felt at that moment. Well, what did I say some time ago about the narrative tensions of the story building to climax? Well, what a climax is a release, a relief. The tension is gone. And Stacy here is feeling a monumental release that I would suggest probably is more than just having killed this nasty guy. And not since the moment before she was struck by lightning had she known the freedom. Well, the implication here, which I've hinted at earlier, is that the bolt of lightning, being struck by lightning, has put a burden on her shoulders. She's never fully understood, and never been able to get out from under. And somehow this action of standing up and killing Noonan has released her, has taken that pressure off her shoulders. What does that mean? Where does it go from here? One of the great things about short stories is, and again, usually as opposed to novels, is leaving us hanging, not knowing what comes next. I'm sure you've all read Hills Like White Elephants, the Hemingway story where the couple are arguing about whether or not to have the woman to have an abortion. And I have a whole class on that. You want to come talk to me about that story? It's a great story. But they have this whole argument, and she changes during that argument. But when the story's over, we don't know what she's going to do. We never know whether she's going to have that abortion or not. So we know here that Stacy has been changed. She feels free and released in a way she hasn't in years. But we also know the future is for her, to use a phrase, fucked. And it's really interesting to me, and I wish we had time to, because I really love your input on this. I don't know the answer to this next question, because I think most authors make the mistake of going too far with their endings. So I, as editor, would very often say to writers, this is a great story, I want to publish it, but you try and tie it off with a bow. It goes too far, you should cut it a page earlier, and it'll be a better ending. Very common. Here, Banks surprises me, because an obvious place to end the story would be, not since the moment before she was struck by lightning had she known the freedom. That would be a really neat ending. That makes sense to me. Instead, for the very first time, we shift. It's not really point of view, because, but it sort of is. We shift point of view to the two French Canadian boys who are coming back to the restaurant, and they have these boy-like lascivious thoughts about Stacy. Donnie and Timmy crunched across the gravel parking lot. The kitchen light and the lamp outside were still on. And when the boys were halfway across the lot, they saw Stacy through the screen door, seated on the stool by the big walk-in fridge. She was asleep, it looked like, or maybe just bored out of her mind listening to one of Noonan's dumb hunting stories. You think he's screwing Stacy? Timmy asked. Come on, man, Stacy's a babe, and he's ancient, man, Donnie said. It's cool she's still here though, he added. She likes us and he'll hire us back just to look good. I wouldn't mind a little of that myself. A little of what? Stacy, man. Donnie punched his younger brother on the shoulder. Yeah, well, you'll have to wait your turn, little fella, he laughed. He waved away the swarming cloud of moths and pulled the screen door open. Timmy entered first, and Donnie, hiding his fading grin behind his hand, followed. That's a very different ending. That's and I, in all honesty, I don't know what to make of it. I'm not going to say it doesn't work. I just don't know what to make of it. Here endeth the sermon. Here endeth my voice. I'd love to get some questions from people here or out in the video world. Yes.
I'm a fan of a outdated concept called local color. And I'm thinking that in this store, plenty of it's provided, and that it's one of the angles for believability and buying instant access.
Absolutely.
Although most people have never been to mountains, they have been around rustic settings with logs and bark. See what I'm saying? And I try to use it too, although it's, well, it's not that tough. It's instant access, and when you need volume, it's there for you. So I had thought one of the elements you would throw out about believability.
Good. This is a very good question about local color and the role it plays and your interest in it, which I think is great. So one of the things we've done to literature, the acts of violence against literature over the last 20, 30 years, is to endless categories of things, young adult and tween and, you know, every possible gradation and romance and, you know, one category after another as a way of marketing, as a way of placing novels. Sophronia Scott has a brilliant new novel that's going to come out in a few months, and we're talking about, well, what are the marketers going to do with it? Where is it going to be? You know, and that drives me crazy. All good fiction, sir, ought to engage local color. Here's the key. If you're using local color just for the sake of creating a vision of a place, a particular place, and not towards a larger end, that's one thing. And also, if it's exaggerated in some way, that's one thing. But I think that great authors are always creating a vivid sense of a very particular place. So Russell Banks, who I think has been for many years one of our great national authors, he doesn't set a national tapestry. He sets New England, the Adirondacks, you know, upstate New York. That's what he writes about. That's what he knows. Hemingway's early stories in Northwest Michigan, you know, Traverse City, Boyne City, Charlevoix, boy, are those centered in, you know, local color, sure. So I think the way you anchor your characters and you anchor your stories, wherever they're set, is as much as possible in a particular place. And this is you know, going back to the very beginning when I was talking about why I like low residency MFAs, because college kids have a generic sense of everything. You know, and college kids really struggle to understand the differences between Ithaca, Michigan and Alma, Michigan. Well, there's a difference. I know, I went to Ithaca today for breakfast. It was great. It's not the same place as Alma. Okay, and so I applaud your interest in that. And I think that's a kind of liberation rather than any kind of weight. Sophronia, do we have any?
Yeah, we have a question online, but I also wanted to add that that is a particular focus in our MFA program, is the study of place, and of, in particular, this beautiful state. So our residency includes activities that are not just in this classroom, but they are out riding bikes, or when we're in the north of Michigan, cross-country skiing. Robert Vivian is going to lead a fishing workshop this summer, specifically to talk about place and understanding that in our writing. Yes, so the question is from Lori, and she wants to know, she says, what about the mention of our lead character as a local hero earlier in the story? Is her action in the end an echo of that heroism?
Wow, what a great question. I've never been asked that before. Is she heroic in the end? Well, I don't know. That involves all kinds of moral questions that I'm not really qualified to answer, but we can all engage them. Does Noonan deserve to get shot? I don't know. He's a schmuck. He's a total schmuck. I'm not sure he deserves to get shot. As I said earlier, I think Stacy's going to find herself in a heap of trouble after this. She does what she has to do. And I think that's one of the secrets, actually, of writing about characters, is creating characters who feel to the reader that they're doing what they have to do.
Mm.
With respect to the assholes deserving to get shot, we don't learn until he's killed the bear that he was shooting it with a .22. And what he was doing is torturing the creature.
Absolutely.
And I almost, and my second reading through the story, I wanted to, and knowing by this time how it ended and going back through the story, I'm looking at it and asking myself, wow, he's kind of beating us over the head with this rotten person by showing how he is deliberately torturing this animal. He knew when he started shooting at it, he wasn't going to kill it with one shot.
Right.
And so he is exalting, if you will, this character in the field of human perversity. And I personally, I thought, geez, I kind of got beat over the head with that. He's really, really set him up for her to shoot him and kill him.
Well, I think that's a really interesting comment, and I think every reader has to weigh that. Does it feel believable? Is it over the top? If it's over the top, it probably shouldn't be done. Is it a measure of how awful this guy is? Does she do the right thing in shooting him? I mean, if this were the real world, what I would wish is that one of those guys on the deck would, smash him in the mouth and take away the rifle. But that's not what happens in the story. And it's sort of all of these questions you can't help but ask or want to ask these questions of the story. But like all good stories, we can't ask. We don't know. The story does what it does, and it ends where it ends, and that's the end of it. Even if our imaginations want to go beyond that, if we believe in the truth of the story. So I spent a lot of time, because this is such a hot topic today, talking about the differences between autofiction and memoir and literary fiction and all of these things. And it's a really interesting question about how do you understand the edge between truth and fiction. And I will tell you my own feeling about this, and no one has to be persuaded by this. I believe, A, that every successful story has its own truth. It's a truth unto itself, without reference to anything else. A great story has its own truth. I also believe that anytime you put the raw chaos of human experience into language, it's like using a catalyst to fundamentally change it. Experience is changed simply by putting it into language. So a memoir may be true, it may have the truth claim that the author lived through some version of this, and yet it can't help but also be to some degree fictional. And you know, we as writers and readers and thinkers must wrestle with these questions in an ongoing way because there's no easy solution to it.
When we were discussing the ending and like, you know, you mentioned how it could have ended with she, you know, by being struck by lightning, she had never known that freedom. But then it goes and has this few extra paragraphs or other paragraphs, not extra necessarily. And I wonder, do we see Timmy and Donnie again and having them speak about Stacy in the way that they do to kind of show like, yes, one man is gone and dead, but like here are these two other young men who are still speaking in a way, you know, like I wonder if he's bringing like almost re-revving up that it's not done, it's not over, like.
Well, it's never over.
Are they next?
Yeah, well, all interesting questions. Yeah, but I think that's right. They're being boys again, you know, thinking about sex.
But I think we know enough of those two characters that, you know, from the beginning, we know she's gonna commit a murder essentially, apart from the debate about whether that's justifiable. Of all the people in that town that could find the crime scene, it's these two who like her. So we have a suggestion that maybe she's gonna get away with it. Maybe they're gonna help fabricate something, or maybe they're gonna just turn her in. So we still don't know.
And we can't.
But of all the people that could discover the crime scene, it's the two people in that town who probably admire her the most.
Well, they have the hots for her. I don't know if they admire her.
Oh, but she was an athlete too. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I
There's
think
a
it's a good
stereotype
question.
there.
I don't know.
It's a good thought. The ending it hurts my brain. But I want to talk about the beginning if we have time.
Sure.
Go back to, okay, in the exposition, I was tempted to complain that it was going on too long. All the stuff about the restaurant, you know, because I was feeling like, okay, I get it. It's a rustic lodge in the mountains. But then I thought, okay, the author knows what he's doing though. And I think he justifies having this here, specifically when he talks about the theme nights and tells us what they have every single night. Like, oh my gosh, I thought in a way the author is informing us about his storytelling style, that it's methodical, and I was almost bracing myself. So later when we get to what's been suggested, it's going to be, and then this happened and this happened, and we're gonna get all the details. So it's not gonna be something happening off camera. It's gonna be
Very
in
much,
your
yeah.
face.
Yeah.
And also I thought maybe the part about the detail of the local corn night, and it's not actually local, is doing double duty in developing the setting in the restaurant and developing the character of Noonan.
Good, and it should. I mean, that's what stuff, you know, and that's certainly what dialogue does. If I was spending a session with you on dialogue, we would be talking about how dialogue both advances the plot. You know, it moves us from here, it gives us information we need to have. But the way dialogue works is also creating character. If you look at this story, go through the story, and how the boys talk is totally different from the way Noonan talks, which is different from the way Stacy talks. Each character has his or her own tone and sound and vocabulary, and that's really important. So dialogue both advances the plot, it creates character, and what we often forget about dialogue is an action. It's not just a transfer of information, it's an action, it's a character choosing to do something. So dialogue's pretty important too. What else we need another question.
It's not exactly a question, I don't know, but I was just thinking, like, it kind of strikes me, the genius of that ending because of what you were talking about, like, it could have ended it here, like, this is the climax, this is what was predicted, and that, but it kind of sets up the expectation in the beginning of like, I'm rolling together these things that on the surface aren't really connected, right? And I've told you what the ending is gonna be. So like, if he ends it there, it's almost not as satisfying because it's like, okay, we knew this was coming.
I think that's a very good point. That on the one hand, stories are ultimately artificial. They're entirely made. But part of the artifice of a good story is creating the illusion of reality. Okay, so that readers, the illusion a writer wants to create for his or her readers is that the story bursts forth in one fell swoop from the author and was never changed. It couldn't have been any other way. This is the way it had to be, and that there's been no change and it was effortless. This, that's part of the truth of the story, and it's the illusion of the story. And I think you're right that in some ways, because he told us at the very beginning, this is what's going to happen. If he had ended with it happening, for my taste, it would have been a little too neat. It'd be tying off the bow just a little too perfectly. And so to have these two boys intrude into it, sounding like horny boys, that's a nice way of furthering the illusion that it's not artifice, though of course it is. Sophrony, are there any other questions from online?
Question about the end, right? So how do you craft a viable ending? Like, and does it take multiple attempts, right? Like, how do you know when you've landed it?
That's a great and really hard question. And I don't think there's a formula. There shouldn't be a formula.
Yeah.
And I think for most authors who've been at it for a while will tell you sometimes it just happens like that. And yeah, that's what happened. And other times they have to work at it and work at it and work at it. And I've spent many hours and days and weeks with authors trying to help them find a way towards the right ending for something. Because it has to feel organic. It has to feel inevitable. And yet it can't feel programmed. And that's hard. That's why I said at the beginning, endings are the hardest part.
Now this is from me. I think it's interesting you use the word inevitable because that's how I feel about Flannery O'Connor's short stories. Like I feel like the beginning of her short stories are like a billboard, like telling you, here's this person's flaws, something horrible is going to happen. And then it's like, but you don't know how it's going to happen. And yet it's weird. It's like when the ending happens, it's like horrifying and surprising. And yet you're like, well, of course, right? So that fascinates me to no end.
Yeah, I just taught Good Man is Hard to Find back at Kenyon, and it's an amazing story. And it is horrifying and funny. And there is that feeling of, oh yeah, we should have seen this coming.
I wonder if anybody else had this cross their mind when we read that first line about night she shot and killed him. Like we were told so obviously that she shot and killed him, like you said, so early on. I took it at face value at first, but as I kept reading and she talked about her attraction to him and all these things, I started almost like second guessing the how literal that line was. And I'm like, did the author really mean it metaphorically somehow? Like, are we getting tricked? Like, is it going to happen in a more metaphor way? Does she kill some part of him, some persona of him in her mind? And so I found myself, and I just wondered if anyone else started questioning it because it was given to us so obviously.
I did, because I thought, well, maybe it'll be an accident. Or when the bear thing shows up, I was like, well, maybe she's trying to shoot the bear and accidentally shoots him. I did not expect it to be so boom.
Right. So, yeah, you're like second guessing.
Yeah.
Or it could have been it occurred to me as I was going through it the first time. You had the juxtaposition of the night she shot and killed him with her desire to have an intimate relationship with him. Did it turn ugly and she defended herself?
Sure, absolutely. I think that's raised as a possibility too.
What were you gonna say, Mary?
Well, I was wondering all along, because I'm trying to think where it's described where she was struck, because didn't she
By lightning?
flip a switch?
She's
In her
at her
house?
parents' house and is on the stairs and flips a switch. And it's that moment that the lightning strikes and goes through the wiring of the house.
Yeah, I questioned that right off the bat. I'm like, maybe there was just something wrong with the electrical system.
Well, no, that's often how it happens. You can be in the
Yes.
shower or you can be,
Could be,
Yeah.
but that to me was like, are we gonna find out it wasn't really lightning? Because I can't think where that was. If she flipped on a switch.
You mean the believability, Mary?
Well, I wondered where that was gonna go.
Oh,
Because it wasn't like she was outside and struck by lightning. She flipped the switch in the house. But she was always saying she got struck by lightning, and I thought, well, was there just something wrong with the electrical system?
okay, so you were wondering if it was gonna come into me that really wasn't like,
It wasn't lightning.
I see it.
But I read it once and I can't remember where that description was, but.
Did anyone else notice the use of the word electrocuted?
Yeah.
When the
Same
bear
earlier,
fell,
yeah.
when the bear fell.
She like paralleled it to
Yeah.
what happened to her.
Yeah.
It's almost like a transference.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is like back to her empathy, like she's constantly like transferring.
Yes, yeah.
Did you find that?
No,
I
I'm
just-
sorry, but you
yeah.
can.
it's where she is telling Noonan about the experience, where she's first confiding to him about what happened to her.
Yeah,
And
It
his
just-
ability or complete inability to empathize with her during that time, like Lynn kept talking about him asking her, but you didn't die, you know, like I felt like that Biggs trying to show like his complete lack of empathy. Like,
Absolutely.
juxtaposing them, like she's like, I want you to feel what I'm trying to connect with you,
And he can't, he won't go there.
right? Almost like a can't though. It seems so far as
Right.
like narcissism or something. you know?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Ronnie, did you want-
So, what?
You might want to say goodbye to everyone.
Oh, not yet, because one of the students, she said her internet was a little shaky, but she wanted to hear more about what you were saying about metaphor. And I will add, you were saying that it's not, the writers use metaphor not simply to make connections, but to help us see things in an enhanced way. So I think she means, talking more about that choice and how metaphor is wielded.
Well, I don't think that every author uses metaphor in a different way. There is no formula for it. There's no right way. There's no wrong way. And some authors use very little or no metaphor at all. In my own writing, I can say that some stories have a fair bit of metaphor and others don't have any. But the point of metaphor is not simply a rhetorical flourish. It's not simply, look what I can do. It's to help a reader see something from a slightly different vantage. And usually the vantage is apropos. So in that example that I was using here, it's comparing those men on the deck to hunting dogs vibrating with anticipation before Noonan starts to shoot the bear. What's great about that is we get a very physical feeling about those men, undifferentiated men on the porch vibrating like dogs. But it's also apropos because they would be hunting dogs in anticipation of the kill and the anticipation of their master doing what what the hunter does. So it's a complex and I think pretty effective metaphor that then quickly gets ripped away and undermined by the actual shooting.
I think metaphor also is important in nonfiction, especially in memoir, because to me, it's about grasping the ambiguous, like what is love? like what is, how much did you hate that person? And these things that we can't really tell the measure of. And when I talk about this in a workshop, for example, I like to put up a picture of that pain chart, right? That you have at the doctor's office. It's like, okay, why do we have this, right? It's because we can't really describe the level of our pain. And I think metaphor does something like that. It
Well,
helps get to that.
language is one of the defining elements of being human. And it is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing. But what I'm always fascinated by are those things that language can't do, where they can't go. Language is lousy at describing music. The most useless, pathetic failure of a statement in the human in English is "I love you." You know what? What does that actually convey? And so you find some other way of going there, into the ineffable. Ineffable means you can't put it into language, because language only goes so far. It's a wonderful thing. And metaphor is one of the ways of doing that, getting to see. I'll give you a little example. Some years ago, Kenyon College is a small college in a very small place, and everyone walks. And we were having some students over for an event one evening. And I was describing to a young woman how to get there. And I said, well, you go up past the bookstore, up Gaskin Avenue, and then you turn left on Woodside, and our driveway is right there on the right. It's gravel, and you'll sit right there. And she's sitting, sitting down, and I see her, doing something with a pen, and assume that she's taking down my words. And then I look down, and I realize she's drawing a picture. She translated it into a map. So she was taking because I am a creature of language, for all the limitations I'm aware of. I'm words all the way. You probably can tell that by now. Words all the way. But here was a person who was more visual and was quite literally translating words into a picture.
And she made it.
I'm not sure.
She's still wondering. Well, thank you, David, for being with us. If we could have a hand for our